Super Scientists, we're looking at 5.3 and we're going to be talking about the different ocean zones today. So we've talked a little bit about ocean exploration. We talked about submersibles and remotely operated vehicles. This is another method in this image that's called sonar, S-O-N-A-R. Sonar is a method that is used to explore how deep an area is in the ocean. So it basically uses sound waves, and it's going to release sonar from those sound waves from a ship that is up on ocean's surface, and it bounces those sound waves off the ocean floor, and depending on how long it takes for that sound wave to return, that tells scientists how deep that area is. So if it takes a really long time, then that means that area is very deep. If it is a quick kind of ping, then that means it is a very shallow area. And so that helps scientists to be able to navigate the ocean floor and also to map it. We're going to start off talking about the intertidal zone. So the intertidal zone is going to be the area that is closest to the shore. It's going to be between the tides. That's literally what that means. So that's going to include a few different habitats. The rocky shore is one of them. So organisms you might find at the rocky shore may look kind of like this. So these are organisms that are generally going to kind of attach to the side of a rock cliff, or they're kind of anchored in some way. And that's because they have to tolerate a lot of changes, specifically changes in the waves. So part of the time they'll be covered by water, part of the time exposed to air, and then also have waves continually beating against them. Tide pools. If you've ever been to the beach, you've probably seen some tide pools. So a tide pool is going to be a sort of depression in the ground, and when it's high tide and the water all comes up to the beach, then it's going to be covered by water. But when it's low tide and the water is out further, it's not going to be covered completely by water, but that depression, that tide pool, is going to keep some of the water, retain some of the water, since it's a lower area. So you may see anemones and barnacles, lots of different types of shells and limpets, sea urchins, sea stars. So you may see a lot of different types of things. Estuary is the next example. So an estuary is going to be an area where you have salt water from the ocean meeting fresh water from rivers. So estuaries a lot of times will be kind of protective areas for animals at a certain point in their lifetime. So they're coastal inlets or bays, and they're going to have brackish water. So brackish just means fresh water and salt water mixed. So it's going to be salt water from the ocean, fresh water from the river, in that the salinity in an estuary can fluctuate. So if you have a lot of water in the river, like from flooding, then that's going to cause there to be lower salinity in this estuary, because it's going to be adding more fresh water. So it's basically diluting the brackish water. If you've had a drought, for example, and you don't have a lot of river water, you don't have a lot of fresh water, or if you are having a lot of high temperatures and heat, so you have a lot of evaporation taking place, then you're going to have really salty water, because it's not going to have as much water. It's going to have a higher saline content. Salt marshes are our next example of habitat in the intertidal zone. You probably have seen salt marshes before, especially if you've been to the beach. As you go over bridges and get closer to the ocean, closer to the beach, then you're going to see more salt marshes. And these are going to be areas where it's got some water interspersed with this grass. And sometimes you'll see people out fishing in these areas. And there's a lot of different types of organisms that you might find in salt marshes. It's going to be a little bit different than the rocky shore and tide pool environments. You're going to see larger organisms usually. Crabs is something, blue crab is something that's pretty common in North Carolina, and it's common for a lot of fishermen to look for. There's also mammals like otters and lots of different types of birds. So you're going to have a lot of fish as well. So salt marshes are a good wetland environment, and they're going to be able to sort of filter out those particles of any pollutants that are in the water. And so that's why it kind of oozes with smelly mud, because this mud is going to have a lot of nutrients kind of packed in it. Mangrove forests, or mangrove swamp as it's sometimes called, these are going to be areas with these really gnarly roots, and the roots are going to be underground but also kind of extend upward in this branchy kind of mess. And so mangrove forests are going to help to break wind and waves, and that means it's going to absorb a lot of that shock and a lot of that force from wind and waves, and that will protect the coastline from erosion. and also protects it from erosion because the mangrove roots are so well embedded in the ground. And it provides a nursery for marine animals. So these are some examples of pictures from when I was in Belize and we went snorkeling in a mangrove swamp. There's some jellyfish here, and these jellyfish were really neat because they were upside down jellyfish, so their tentacles actually were facing upward. And this is what some of the root nodules look like under the water. So some of the root nodules from these mangrove roots or these mangrove trees. And I was actually able to see like some small barracudas and things like that swimming in the water. So they're really protective areas. And this is me holding a large sea star. And that was a really heavy, really large echinoderm that we were able to find in this area. So organisms that are living in the intertidal zone are going to have to tolerate lots of changes. They're going to have to tolerate waves, changes in salinity, like in the estuary, temperature, so being colder, being warmer, just depending on if it's exposed to air or water, and being exposed to water and being exposed to air. So next we're going to talk about the neritic zone, and we're going to talk about the deep zone, the open ocean. And one thing that you might find at the very bottom of the ocean are hydrothermal vents. And these are really cool areas. Sometimes these are referred to as black smokers because they have this black hydrogen sulfide smoke that they emit. And it's just going to be basically mineral towers, these little towers that are made of mineral deposits. And you're also going to have tube worms and shrimp and crabs and mussels and lots of bacteria. So they're really neat environments. And they are at the very bottom of the ocean. And remember, we talked about how sunlight is the source of energy for most living things. Well, there's no sunlight at the bottom of the ocean. So what do these organisms use as their source of energy? What is the base of these food chain? These food webs at hydrothermal vents. And that's going to be these bacteria that are chemosynthetic. So they use this hydrogen sulfide that is being emitted from down inside the earth. So it goes through a process of chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis. So it does not use light, it uses chemicals. Here's an image that shows you an algae bloom. And this may be something that you see in several different sections. So this algae bloom is going to be where you have perhaps some eutrophication starting, but there's a lot of algae in these areas. And sometimes these can be very harmful. And in this case, you can see it's killed the fish. And a lot of times you'll have these notices that are put out, or you may have signs even at the beach or at coastal inlet areas warning people that there may be algal blooms and warning people to stay away because it can make you sick. So these areas have a lot of algae, and when you have algae blooms, it lowers the dissolved oxygen, and that's what can lead to fish kills. And in this example, you can see that this one individual fish has died, and we can probably assume that there's a lot of other fish, so this may be a large fish kill site because of such low dissolved oxygen. So in the neritic zone is going to be the middle one that's over the continental shelf area. So this is going to be the location of where upwelling is going to be taking place. So the neritic zone is going to be fairly shallow, so it's going to be exposed to a lot of sunlight for the most part. And we're also going to have upwelling that takes place, pushing nutrients upward. It's in a neritic zone from deeper in the ocean. Kelp forest is one of the habitats in the neritic zone. So kelp forest is going to be these large stalks of kelp. It looks kind of like seaweed. It's a really heavy algae. And it attaches to the ocean floor by these little holdfasts. And so that will help to kind of root it. And then being a plant-like material, this plant is going to grow upward towards the sunlight. It's going to be these thick stalks. And a lot of organisms like fish and otters, sea urchins will use this as their habitat. Coral reefs are another example of something that we'll find in the neritic zone. So these are warm tropical coral reefs, and corals are actually animals. So coral animals live in these tiny little polyps, these little circular areas in these different types of corals. And these are some images from when I was in Belize. We also got to snorkel in a few different coral reef areas, and it was really interesting that the very vibrant, colorful areas were the most healthy coral reefs, and the ones that were really lighter and discolored and fairly white had been coral bleached. They had some kind of acidification that was going on, and these corals were dying. And that generally is a result of the emissions of fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide getting into the water. So our open ocean zone is next. So this goes down to our deep zone at the very bottom of the ocean. So the open ocean zone is only going to have a small part at the surface that receives sunlight. And that's sometimes referred to as the photic zone because photo means light. So you're just going to have sunlight up here at the top of the surface. And so the surface zone is going to have lots of nutrients. However, further down, you're not going to have as many nutrients because you don't have all that photosynthesis taking place. So there's 3 zones that are references to the amount of light that is given in the open ocean. So the surface zone is at the top. It's going to basically extend down as far as the sunlight reaches, and it supports the growth of algae. So we're going to see a wide variety of organisms in the surface zone because we are able to have algae living there. We're going to have marine plants and photosynthesis taking place. Our next zone going downward into the ocean is a transition zone. And this truly is a transition from sunlight to darkness. It's going to be transitioning from warmth to really cold. And sometimes it's called the thermocline, thermo being a reference to heat. The bottom of the open ocean zone is the deep zone, the benthic zone. And it's referenced, this benthic word here is a reference to the benthos organisms, the ones that we see at the bottom of the ocean. And this is going to be the coldest and the darkest zone. And I think it's the most interesting zone because it has lots of organisms that have had to adapt, and they have to be good hunters or they have to be able to survive in these really high pressure environments. And one image that I put here, this is bamboo coral. And it's black and white coral, and it fluoresces, it bioluminesces this kind of blue color when it's agitated. So we talked about coral reefs being in the neritic zone. There's also really cool coral reefs at the bottom of the ocean. And they are not going to rely on algae and symbiotic relationship with a zooanthele. These organisms are going to be in these cold, deep, dark, environments at the very bottom of the ocean. And so a lot of them have some kind of mechanism that will allow them to sting prey and allow them to eat. This is one of my favorite organisms. This is from the first time that I was a teacher at sea. I got to hold a giant isopod, Bathynomus giganteus, and it's my favorite. So this is a great example of deep sea gigantism. So we see these kind of roly-poly bugs up on the land. You'll see them sometimes when it rains, like around the dirt and stuff, and they roll up in a defensive posture. That's why we call them roly-polies. But this guy is huge, and it's really neat arthropod to be able to hold. Bioluminescence is one thing that we see with organisms at the very bottom of the ocean in the benthic zone. Not every organism is bioluminescent, but some are, and they produce these really beautiful patterns and colors. So bioluminescence, bio is life, lumen is light. So it's living organisms producing light. And they do that for a variety of reasons. It could be to attract a mate, it could be to cause a distraction, it could be to lure in prey. There are a lot of different types of resources that we get from the ocean. Water, desalination processes can help us to get fresh water from ocean water. Also, if we conserve water, that will help to conserve those resources. Fuel, there's a lot of oil drilling that takes place. And minerals, there are a lot of different types of minerals that can be mined from the bottom of the ocean. Sand, diamonds, gold, so those are a few examples. And who should protect the oceans? So anybody should take action to be able to protect the ocean or to help clean it up and pick up trash and to be able to conserve our water resources. However, federal government has put into place some different mechanisms to allow for that to take place as well. The Clean Water Act is one piece of legislation that allows for protection for the ocean to help maintain the integrity of our ocean's water, and to help prevent pollution sources and to help clean up. And the Environmental Protection Agency as well. So the EPA is responsible for carrying this out. And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is also charged with ensuring that our drinking water is safe as well.